My name is Paul Solomon, and I am the chair. Look forward to a fairly full agenda today, discussing the specialty court grants as our primary topic. I'll kick it over to Director Sanchagrin to call the roll for us.
Thank you, Chair. Commissioner Auxier?
Present.
Commissioner Beach? I have not
Present.
seen her yet, but oh, wonderful.
Present.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Just in the nick of time.
Just in the nick of time. Commissioner Bovet?
Present.
Commissioner Freeman?
Here.
Excellent. And Chair Solomon?
Present.
Oh, and I cannot believe I almost forgot our legislators. Commissioner Przanski? And Commissioner Lewis. Okay, so we have a quorum of our voting members. All five of our current voting members are present. Chair, you may begin whenever you're ready.
Great. Well, we'll go ahead and get started. The first item on the agenda, I believe we'll hear from Rachel about the 2023-25 Specialty Court Grant Awards. Rachel, are you with us? You're on mute.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I am uploading this presentation real fast. Chair Solomon, can you see that? Is it loaded?
Not yet. Now I can. Yep.
Okay. Just a note, I've had some issues in Teams recently with presentations. So as I'm advancing slides, if they're not advancing on your end, can you please let me know okay, thank you. Okay, good afternoon. I'm Rachel MacArthur, CJC staff, and today I am bringing forward the Specialty Court Grant Program funding recommendations from the Grant Review Committee. So this is the Grant Review Committee members, the current ones. One of the things that we have tried to do is get people on the Grant Review Committee who have had experience with different types of specialty courts. And so we've got members that have been on this committee for quite some time. We did have some new members. And so we have a good mix of members who have expertise in different court types, rather than just focusing on drug courts, which has kind of what has been done in the past. So, and this is just, again, kind of a graphic of how the Specialty Court Grant Program operates according to roles. And we today are in this gray box where the commission, you all will be considering funding recommendations by the Grant Review Committee. And then ultimately we'll make funding decisions on the applications for this grant cycle. So this just shows the total funds requested versus the total funds available, with the last three columns showing a breakdown of those total funds available. And so we're about 28.7 million total funds that were requested this time, with about 19.1 funds available for this grant cycle, with most of those funds coming from general funds. We do have lottery funds that will be for the veterans courts. They'll be funneled specifically to the veterans courts that have applied. And then there are about 3.4 million in federal funds that will make up that 19.1 million for this grant cycle. So as you can see, we had to make some pretty deep reductions to get to this number of available funds. And so over the next few slides, I'm going to walk you all through that process on how those reductions were made. So to go all the way back to the beginning of this grant cycle, we did have a two-part process with this application process. There was a preliminary round where applicants there was a quantitative and a qualitative piece to that. And the grant review committee met in May. And based on that analysis of that preliminary application, they did provide very specific feedback to the applicants that was based on the needs and improvement for adherence to standards. That was really the foundation of this entire process. And also recognizing those resources that were needed and filling that gap with CJC funds so that courts were able to operationalize those standards. And then in general, applicants were also given feedback to make appropriate requests for treatment funds, as well as appropriate FTE funding requests for court coordinators. So while they got very specific feedback, they also got general feedback from the grant review committee from their preliminary application. And so this process right here was really the anchor for the analysis of funding requests. And so on the next slide, I'm going to explain to you the methodology that CJC staff developed to make funding reduction recommendations to the grant review committee. And the goal here was to make them as consistent, transparent, and equitable as possible. And so we relied on this anchor to develop that methodology. So for the base level of funding is what we referred to this, where we had recommendations for reductions that we presented to the grant review committee. Personnel was maintained at current service level. Training and travel was capped at $3,000 per person or $12,000 total. We reduced a drug testing request, a treatment request, and a supplies request to reflect current and active population, not capacity, with the idea that we would recognize through the biennium that there is room for growth. And so we did take that into account while making those reductions in those particular categories. We reduced the administrative request by 50%. Things such as office spaces, meeting rooms, jail beds, and any supplemental treatment requests were not funded. And we removed any request that was an unallowable. That's outlined in our grant administration guide. So with this methodology, we applied this across every final application as we went through and analyzed funding request with each specific court. The exceptions that we made were where we recognized applicants were responding specifically to grant review committee feedback. So for example, if a applicant was given feedback to increase training and to develop an onboarding process for new hires, and their training request exceeded the $12,000, we took that into account in accepting that. And so we really tried to protect the request, the use of funding requests that was linked directly to grant review committee feedback, drug testing, personnel, those types of things we evaluated and tried to protect those requests as best we could. And so those were the exceptions to this methodology as we went through the process of analyzing the applications. So with these reductions made across all of the courts, we were still left with a little over 1.6 million that was needed to reduce to get to the 19.1 million in available funds. And so we asked the grant review committee to consider a scenario or a number of scenarios where reductions could be made across the board so that we would meet that number of 19.1. And so with this base level recommendation, based on the methodology that I just went through, the grant review committee adopted a scenario where there would be an additional reduction in supplies by 50%, an additional reduction in housing, and to reduce the administrative ask by an additional about 10%. The math on that, we had to make sure because it was connected to all of their requests. And so when we reduced it, we couldn't make it across the board 10%. We had to adjust for it. So I think it ended up being about 9.4, 9.3%. So the reason why the grant review committee focused on these particular categories, the reduction in supplies, reduction in housing, and the reduction in the administrative ask, is these categories were not specifically linked to any grant review committee feedback. And so going back to our methodology, those were the things, the funding requests that we did our best to protect. And we recognize that these three categories where there was enough room to make further reductions so that we could meet that 19.1 in available funds. So this was the scenario that the grant review committee adopted in their process to be able to meet that particular number. So before I go through, I'm going to present, Chair Solomon, I just want to remind you, I'm going to be presenting by court type, very similar to what we did in the analysis. However, at the very end, with the overall award totals, before it goes to a vote, they will be done by county. And just as a reminder, we talked about this in June. That's just simply because there's a history of abstention among the commissioners. And so I wanted to make this process as easy as possible for you in terms of making motions. So that is where that difference is going to be in presentation. So.
Okay, great. So are you getting ready to move into the county allocations now?
Yes, I'm gonna go
Okay.
into the recommended funding amount by the grant review committee by court type, and then I'll
Okay.
go into the county allocation at the end.
Okay. Before you do, I want to open it up for any questions, and I want to just make a comment, and that is that I find it a little troubling that you have reduced the housing allocation by 80%, given how important we know housing is for this population. So I'm a little curious about why that was, why you chose the 80%, which seems like a pretty high number, which would pretty much eliminate most of the housing resources available for the specialty courts.
Yeah, Chair Solomon, that's a great question. The grant review committee spent a lot of time on this particular decision and recognizing that it was housing and that there is a need for it among this population. They did also at the same time acknowledge that given the emphasis on housing and availability across the state, there was a possibility that other funding streams would be made available to these courts, and other opportunities to receive funding for housing would be possible. And so it was definitely a discussion that they went over with recognizing that there were possible other opportunities for funds for housing that they could potentially obtain. We also, within our process throughout the biennium, will have an amendment process set up to where if as the biennium goes through and things change and things become more of a priority in terms of the need for funds, we do have an amendment process set up where grantees will be able to request the moving of funds into particular categories. And so that is also an opportunity for them if needed to move housing or to move funds into the housing category. And then we also, based on some of the changes that we've made going forward with the disbursement of funds as well as the tracking of funds, we anticipate being able to have a supplemental round after the first year, where if applicants recognize and identify that as a need, that is also something where they'll have an opportunity to request funds for that specific category as well.
All right, do others have questions at this point? All right, let's continue.
Okay. Okay, so the adult drug treatment courts, this is just half of them. I will be presenting another slide, but this is the majority of the court type that we have for applicants. You can just see the court, the 23-25 request, and then the 23-25 GRC recommendation for funding. I do want to note that to the commissioners that you all were provided a table in advance that has a little bit more detail or information. So I'm happy to answer questions from either if you have them.
Well, I just want to make a comment, and that is, I thought the table that we received was actually pretty helpful because it showed the 21-23 allocation. And if you take a look at like Clackamas County, for example, it looks like they're receiving a 70% cut. But in fact, their 21-23 award was $204,000. So what they're receiving is really just a little bit less than they received in the prior biennium.
Yeah, Chair Solomon, correct. That's a great point. That is one of the things in part of our methodology at maintaining current service level was definitely something that we took into account was prior award as well. So absolutely. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next part of adult drug treatment courts. I do want to note we did have a new applicant. Malheur County applied for funds for the first time. So we do have a new adult drug treatment court recommended funding for a new, at least new to CJC for funding from the Grant Review Committee.
So are they up and running? Because I know in the spreadsheet you provided, it showed that they actually had participation in 21-23.
Yes, so Chair Solomon, yes, they are up and running. They are an existing court, which is why they are part of this competitive grant. The difference is they just never asked for CJC funds. And so we were able to get some information in the past from them, but they are, in terms of receiving CJC funds, this is the first time that they've applied.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so if there's no questions about adult drug, I'm going to move on to mental health treatment courts. Mental health treatment courts are our next biggest number of courts that we have across the state. Any questions or comments on this? If I move too fast through these slides, Chair Solomon, please stop me. Family treatment courts are the next court type that we analyzed. I do want to note that Coos, Harney, Lincoln, and Lynn County were all implementation courts the last grant cycle. And so they are continuing through, which is good news. They've only been up and running for a short time. And so, you know, continuing to grow throughout, you know, the past 18 months as well as into the next 2 years. So that's good news that they're still in operation and still striving to meet specialty court standards. Okay, juvenile drug treatment courts. Again, very similar to Malheur, Lane County, they were an existing court. And this is the first time that they have applied for CJC funds as well. And then veterans courts, Lane and Marion County. I do want to note that, again, like I mentioned earlier, the lottery funds do go towards these courts in particular. We do have a few courts that have veteran tracks within them, such as like Columbia County. And so any remaining lottery funds will be diverted to those particular courts if we don't use all of the funds for these two courts. And then the last court type is the DUI courts, and we just have Clackamas and Multnomah County. Okay, we do have one process that I just quickly want to go through to make y'all aware of it. To make things a little bit more efficient for the counties and for OJD, we have, this is the second time we'll be doing this, but we have allowed counties to directly allocate funds to OJD. It's their decision as to whether or not they want to do it. And how much they want to allocate to OJD. And the purpose of this is so that CJC can have one contract, one IAA with OJD with those funds, rather than the counties having to contract with OJD. And so rather than having 49 contracts that need to be approved and signed and funds going through, as you can see, most of this is tied to personnel. And so from an efficiency standpoint, CJC having one contract with OJD makes that process much easier, so the money can get where it needs to go faster. And so we had a budget sheet where counties could allocate money in the personnel, supplies, and training and travel. And again, in whatever category they saw fit, and the amount that they decided to allocate was up to the county. So we did have some counties that chose not to. But overall, given all the court types combined, these are the totals that will be allocated to OJD from the counties.
And so you're just changing the manner of contracting this cycle from years past?
Chair Solomon, that's correct, yes.
And have you tracked the OJD spending? I imagine you have over current biennia or past biennia. Is this number fairly consistent with as a percentage what has been spent or allocated to OJD?
Yeah, Chair Solomon, this previous that biennium that just closed, they had a little over 6 million allocated to them, and they spent all of it, if not most of it. And so just because most of this goes to personnel. Also, they are required in terms of financial reporting. Those requirements are the same for OJD as they are for the counties. And so we get quarterly updates on their spending within these three categories, where it's going, and we can track it that way as well. So.
Great, thank you.
Okay. So for the total recommended funding, if you look at the top part, again, just a reminder, the total available funds were a little over 19.1 million. With the total funds requested at 28.7 million. The total funds allotted were 19.1 million, with the percentage of total requests filled at 67%. And again, this is now by county, and we broke it up by the county allocation and then the county allocated funds to OJD. So you could see the difference there, and then the total award recommended for approval by the Grant Review Committee. And this is the rest of those counties with totals at the bottom. That would be about 11.8 million going to the county. 7.2 million allocated to OJD from counties, with a total of 19.185505 of available funds. Okay, Chair Solomon, for ease of accounting for those abstentions, and counties also, county allocated money, OJD allocated money. We did draft some possible motion language if needed to approve the grant review committee recommendations for funding for the specialty court grant.
Great. And so, as we have done in the past, we've pulled out the other grants so commissioners can declare potential conflicts. So at this point, do commissioners have any questions of Rachel about the allocations that are being recommended? Commissioner Vice Chair Bovet.
I don't really have any questions, but at the appropriate moment, I wouldn't mind making a motion, but I'd also like to just make a quick statement for the record.
Yeah, go ahead.
And I know I kind of sound like a broken record sometimes, but I think this presentation has highlighted a number of things, some of which the chair has pointed out. But one of the things that it's highlighted yet again is the lack of adequate funds to meet the need. I know we're not responsible for that, but I like to put that on the record because the legislature ought to be listening. To these specialty court programs are life-saving for many folks. Mental health court, drug court, and we are in a mental health and addictions crisis. And so cutting any of these asks after CJC staff has done their great filtering that they do to exclude things that shouldn't be funded or portions of things that shouldn't be funded or can't legally be funded. And then when we're cutting further because we just don't have adequate funds, I think it's the wrong thing to be doing right now, but it's not on CJC. I think it's on the legislature. And I just wanted to state that of record. And with that, I'd be happy to make a motion to approve the Specialty Court Grant Review Committee funding recommendations to include the allocations to counties and OJD for all counties, with the exception of the courts in Douglas, Lane, Multnomah, Washington, and Yamhill counties, which I presume will take by separate motions because of where we all work.
I appreciate those comments and wholly concur. There is a motion that has been made by the vice chair. Is there any discussion of that motion?
This is Commissioner Freeman. I'll second that motion.
All right, there's a motion been made, seconded by Commissioner Freeman. Ken, do you want to take the roll?
It'd be my pleasure, Chair. Commissioner Auxier,
Yes.
Commissioner Beach,
Yes.
Vice Chair Bovet,
Yes.
Commissioner Freeman,
Yes.
and Chair Solomon.
Yes,
The motion passes unanimously, Chair.
great. All right, so next let's take up the motions for the remaining 5 counties, one at a time. I would entertain a motion with commissioners allowed to abstain for any one of, let's start with Douglas, actually.
I would make a motion to approve the Specialty Court Grant Review Committee funding recommendations to include the allocations for Douglas County.
I'll second that.
Motion for Douglas County by Vice Chair Bovet, seconded by Commissioner Auxier. All those in favor, or actually Ken, roll call?
Of course, Commissioner Auxier,
Yes.
Commissioner Beach,
Yes.
Vice Chair Bovet,
Yes.
Commissioner Freeman,
Abstain.
and Chair Solomon.
Yes.
And that passes unanimously with one abstention by Commissioner Freeman.
All right. Is there someone willing to make a motion for the Lane County allocation?
Well, in the interest of efficiency, I'll just keep rolling until
Great.
somebody else beats me to the punch. I make a motion to approve the Specialty Court Grant Review Committee funding recommendations for Lane County.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
All right, roll call, please.
Commissioner Auxier,
Yes.
Commissioner Beach,
Yes.
Vice Chair Bovet,
Yes.
Commissioner Freeman,
Yes.
and Chair Solomon.
I will abstain and declare a potential conflict of interest.
Thank you, Chair. Another unanimous passage of that motion with an abstention by yourself.
Right.
I would make a motion to approve the Specialty Court Grant Review Committee funding recommendations for Multnomah County.
There's a second.
I'll second.
Ken.
Commissioner Auxier,
I'll abstain from this one.
Commissioner Beach,
Yes.
Commissioner Freeman, Vice Chair Bovet,
Yes.
Commissioner Freeman,
yes,
and Chair Solomon.
Yes.
Another unanimous vote with an abstention by Commissioner Beach.
No, the extension was by Commissioner
Oh,
Auxier.
excuse me, by Commissioner Auxier. Yes, thank you. That'll teach
Yep.
me to talk while I'm typing.
Now, if I could skip ahead to Yamhill, then I'm hoping somebody will come back and pick up Washington. So I'll make a motion to approve the Specialty Court Grant Review Committee funding recommendations for Yamhill County.
There's a second.
I'll second that.
Ken, roll call, please.
Commissioner Auxier,
Yes.
Commissioner Beach,
I will also abstain due to direct conflict. Thank you.
Vice Chair Bovet,
Yes.
Commissioner Freeman,
yes,
and Chair Solomon.
Yes.
This time, a motion passed with all voting in favor except for an abstention by Commissioner Beach.
All right. Is there someone other than Vice Chair Bovet who would be willing to make the motion for Washington County's approval?
this is Freeman. I'll move to approve the Washington County Specialty Court funding.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
All right. Motion that's been seconded. Ken, roll call, please.
Commissioner Auxier,
Yes.
Commissioner Beach,
Yes.
Vice Chair Bovet,
I will abstain for potential conflict of interest.
Commissioner Freeman,
Yes,
and Chair Solomon.
Yes.
A unanimous passage with an abstention by Vice Chair Bovet.
All right. And I'm assuming when we did these, when we said specialty courts, we weren't breaking out the courts separately for approval. We're doing all of them as one slate, correct?
Chair Solomon, that is correct.
All right. We are cooking with gas. Let's see, what is next up on the agenda? I realized that I erred and not asking if we had anybody signed up for public comment at the top of the agenda. Ken or Jenny, do we have anybody signed up for public comment today?
As far as I know, Chair, unless Jenny has received someone signing up, we do not have anybody who has signed up for public comment.
We
All
do
right.
not have anybody signed up, no.
Okay, great. We will hear next from Kelly Officer about the 2023 bias crime report. Hey, Kelly.
Thank you, Chair Solomon and Commissioners. I'm Kelly Officer, Research Director at the CJC, and I have several slides prepared for you today to provide the key takeaways of our 2023 Bias Crimes Report. It's a very lengthy report with a lot of information, and so we've tried to just get the key takeaways for you today in a succinct PowerPoint. So let me go ahead and pull that up. If it works. Okay, can everybody see this PowerPoint slide? Excellent, great. Okay, so we released, this report was due July 1st. This is our 4th annual bias crimes report that's required by Senate Bill 577 that passed in 2019. Several members of our research team worked pretty hard to get this report finished up, and I especially want to thank Dr. Ashmini Karadal for her tireless work on this report. I also want to thank our partners at DOJ, Faye Stetzwaters and Johanna Costa for their support to us in this report, but also just for all the work they do in running the hotline and providing services and all the other things that they do to provide those services that the DOJ has. So the report is lengthy and has a lot of information. So here's just a list of the data sources that are included. So we have information on reports to the bias response hotline, offenses that are reported to law enforcement in NIBRS or the National Incident-Based Reporting System, arrest data, prosecution data. We'll get into some detail on the prosecution data in a coming slide, the court data, and conviction and sentencing data. So first up, we'll look at the bias response hotline trends. So this chart shows those monthly reports back to January 2020, the inception of the hotline. And the hotline was created by Senate Bill 577. So you can see a substantial increase over time in reports to the hotline. Some of this is to be expected as the hotline gets up and running and awareness and outreach continues to increase about the hotline. Some of it could be that those who have experienced a bias incident or crime, or those who have witnessed one, are willing to call into the hotline to report it or willing to seek out services. It could also be from an increase in activity in the community. So for the first year of the hotline in 2022, you can see we have about 1,100 reports. In 2021, that increases to just under 1,700, a 53% increase. And in 2022, increases to just under 2,900 reports, a 72% increase. And approximately 30% of the calls are for bias crimes, and then the remainder are for non-criminal bias incidents.
Kelly, can you, as a newbie to this report, can you tell me how we're defining bias crimes?
I can, yes. And actually Senate Bill 577 did redefine the bias crime statutes. So we have bias 1 and bias 2, and actually having a prosecutor and a former prosecutor on the commission may be better equipped to handle this. The old definition for bias in the first degree required multiple defendants to be involved in the same incident, and that was redefined in 2019 to capture person crime events or more serious crime events motivated by bias. And then those that are not person crime related, motivated by bias, is at the bias 2 level. I'd be more than happy for the other commissioners to jump in and fill in my gaps there if I've oversimplified that. I will say too, an important part of the bill was that it created a definition of a non-criminal bias incident. Oh, I'm not sure if somebody was trying to chime in there or just.
I think someone had their mic off.
Oh, shoot. Okay, no worries. And so that was a really important component, because a lot of times law enforcement is called to respond to an event that is clearly motivated by bias, but it is not a crime. And so law enforcement at that point really can't do a whole lot. And so the idea here is now law enforcement can refer folks to the hotline. They can report that incident, so there is a record of it, and then they can also receive support and services from folks at the hotline. Consequently, if someone is not comfortable reporting a bias crime to law enforcement and report it to the hotline, if they choose to then take the steps to report to law enforcement, folks at the hotline will guide them through that process of reporting to law enforcement. I see that Ken was maybe going to save me on my bias crime definition.
But Kelly did a great job of explaining. I just thought I'd provide just a tiny bit more context since we have this nice forum here with a lot of folks listening in. So the original iteration of bias crimes, Kelly was exactly right. It focused on the number of defendants who were involved, and a lot of that grew out of some concerns about skinhead and neo-Nazi gangs during the 1980s. And so regardless of the harm committed, it was really trying to focus on that gang activity. But I think over time, we've really realized some of the inequities that would occur for folks to where, like, if you simply had 2 defendants, then a property crime could be treated very different than a person crime. And so part of what the Bias Crime Working Group worked towards that I participated on was focusing on the nature of the harm as opposed to the number of the defendants. And that's where the bifurcation between property crimes versus person crimes that really grew out of. In addition, there were some refinements made to the protected classes that were found in Oregon statute as well. And so it's a pretty significant overhaul from where we were for much of the history of our bias crime statute.
Great. Thank you, Ken.
Yeah, great. Okay, yes, feel free to jump in as other questions come up. Oh, can't figure out how to, there we go. So some of the key takeaways from the trends in the reports to the bias response hotline. BIPOC individuals are more likely to report or to be victims of bias crimes than white individuals. And we do see year over year that the number of bias reports by BIPOC individuals continues to grow. Consistent with previous years, the majority of the incidents are for anti-race and anti-color reports. However, in 2022, there was a significant increase in reports that were based on anti-gender, anti-sexual orientation, and anti-national origin bias. And BIPOC individuals are primarily targeted due to race and color, while white individuals are targeted due to sexual orientation and or gender identity. So that gives a summary of some of the bias motivation changes over the last couple of years. Did that, sorry. There we go. Okay. And then finally, a key takeaway for 2022 is that reports to the hotline made by children has more than doubled from 2021 compared to 2022, and bias motivated reports in K through 12 schools has also increased by 172%. I know that Faye Stetzwaters at DOJ has worked pretty closely with the Department of Education on bias response in schools, and that's an ongoing area of attention. The hotline is available to children to both report an incident and also to seek services for that.
And Kelly, I may be jumping ahead, but do you have corollary data on referrals, prosecutions, convictions?
Yes. I think you did jump ahead just a
Okay,
little bit.
okay, then
Yeah,
I'll
sure.
seal it.
And actually, I think maybe what you might have been getting at is a little bit here. This is looking at the gap from reports to the hotline compared to reports to law enforcement. So the blue bar here is reports to the hotline for bias crimes. And then the yellow are reports to law enforcement that are in NIBRs of bias crimes. So again, we see the substantial increase for reports to the hotline, but reports to law enforcement have stayed relatively flat over the last several years. So we see that gap in reporting for bias crimes. When we break that apart even further, we see that it's particularly pronounced for BIPOC and young bias crime victims. And so there is still a need to engage with these communities to report to law enforcement. For offenses that are reported to law enforcement, bias crimes that are based on sexual orientation increased by 39% from 2020 to 2021, and then another 27% from 2021 to 2022. And anti-religious bias increased in 2022, with anti-Semitic bias continuing to represent the majority of those at close to 50% in 2022. And property crimes accounted for the majority of bias crimes in the first 2 years, 2022 and 2020 and 2021. And now in 2022, we see that simple or aggravated assault is the most frequent type of bias crime, occurring in about 30% of cases for offenses reported to law enforcement.
And do you have any thoughts about the disparity between the hotline reports and the actual law enforcement reports?
Yes, and there is some work in the report to break this out a little bit more. We do see differences in terms of where we see that gap occurring, right? So the simple version here is we see it for BIPOC and young bias crime victims. And so it does look like, folks who are young or BIPOC folks are not as willing to report an incident to law enforcement, which I think speaks to the need to continue to build education and trust with communities to be willing to report this type of information. The hotline provides another option as well, as I described there. Now the hotline is a victim focused referral effort there. So it's really up to the victim if they want to report to law enforcement. But if they do and they would like some assistance with that, the hotline will assist with that. So there is an effort to have an intermediary there, but it's not always the case that victims will want to report to law enforcement or engage in pursuing prosecution once they have been victimized. Okay, and then the final slide here is on the prosecution data. So you may recall from last year's report and the first year's report, we had 3 pilot counties where we received prosecution data. And this was the first year that we had statewide data collected on bias crime prosecution. And so this map here shows the counts by county. Since it's the first year and the reporting requirement started in July 2022, it's still a little early to be able to track those trends and make too many conclusions. For the cases that were reported for that 6-month period, 40% of those remain open, and I think that won't be a surprise to any of you folks here. But we'll take some time to track the outcomes of those cases as well as those that are referred in 2023. And we do see that about a quarter of the cases result in a no file, and that's most often due to insufficient evidence. So we do see that particular trend on the prosecution side. Our report also has the trends of arrests and convictions and sentences. We do see, this law change happened right as COVID was starting to occur. So we do see some longer time periods for case resolution still in analyzing that data. So this is an annual report. It comes out every July 1. And so next year we'll have another year of the statewide DA data and then also another year of the court and conviction data as well for the trends for bias crimes. And I'll conclude there.
Great, thank you for that report, Kelly. Do other commissioners have questions? Comments? All right, well, thanks to all who put in the good work to put that together, and I look forward to taking a deeper dive into the report, but appreciate the overview. All right, I'm not sure which executive staff we're going to hear from, Ken, but I'm assuming you will be included in the agency updates.
Just me today. So the primary update that I wanted to provide for everybody was just a quick breakdown of legislative session, really with a focus on the tasks that CJC was given and just kind of our budget breakdown. So we were able to have a relatively successful legislative session as far as our programming is concerned. We were able to get Senate Bill 344 passed through the legislature, which extended justice reinvestment for a second decade. And so we were very happy about that. It is now extended through 2033. And so we won't have to worry about that for a little bit. We were also funded at current service level for justice reinvestment, which would equate to $53,900,000 and some change there. And so we'll be considering justice reinvestment applications as we get into the fall. So we should expect to see that on your docket coming soon. Our illegal marijuana market enforcement grant was also renewed, though not at the same funding level that we saw during the emergency sessions in the past biennium. So the base grant that we have with illegal marijuana is $6 million in funds that come from marijuana taxes. That continues. We were also given a one-time cash infusion of $5 million in the end of session bill. So we have a total of $11 million that will be available for counties and for local jurisdictions during this funding cycle. With the large cash infusion that we received last biennium, we really tried to work with our grantees and county partners to try to extend their grants out as far as possible because we weren't sure how much money we would receive in the future. So what we're doing right now with them is we're working with all of our grantees and reaching out to everybody who we've worked with to see where they stand with funding so that we can time this next cash infusion as best as possible to meet the needs of the grantees. If you recall, in the past, we usually try to get this grant through. We might have been doing it actually at this meeting historically, very, very quickly to try to get things moving. However, we are delaying it this time while we work with our grantees because we know that most, if not all, had funding that could extend farther into the future. So expect to see that soon. Yes,
So
Chair.
Ken, I just want to make sure I'm understanding you correctly here. So the end of session bill that you got the additional 5 million, was that tied to the marijuana?
That is
fund-
one-time general fund, Chair. So
Okay.
that is not marijuana.
So that's just
tax money.
general fund money that you
Yes.
have, that the CJC has in their budget for all of your grants combined or additional.
It was specifically earmarked for the illegal marijuana market
that's what-
enforcement grant, but it is
Yeah.
general fund dollars, yes.
Okay, that's what I was trying to get at.
Okay.
Okay, so it's reduced from 6 million in the special session to 5 million.
Well, last biennium in total, when we took the base grant of the 6 million in marijuana grant dollars, with all of the additional funds that we were provided through the special session and then the short session, we actually had 32 million last biennium that we awarded. So this biennium we have 11. So certainly quite a different amount. Yeah. Great.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chair, may I make a comment, please?
Yes, please.
So, Director, hopefully when you're looking at this marijuana stuff, you look back sort of to the beginning. When some counties applied for that funding, they, I'm not going to say didn't follow the rules, but they certainly put in for funding for positions and people differently than other counties did. So the rule was that you weren't supposed to supplant any current funding or any positions. Some counties had started their program prior to this funding being available, and some counties didn't. But I hope we look back and look at what the problem is holistically and make a determination based on the need and the programs that are going on, not just what last year's funding was. I do believe that last year there was some skewed applications.
Thank you, Commissioner Freeman. Your comment is very well taken. We know that whenever we have these grant asks, some counties, I think, they try to employ the old approach of ask for double or triple of what you need and hope that they get, half or of what they can. But I know some other counties really focus on just saying what they need, and then oftentimes that puts them at a disadvantage. And so that's something that we're actively trying to work to make sure that we're able to make the best awards that we can, so that that type of gamesmanship doesn't necessarily result in inequitable outcomes. Certainly.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions about the marijuana money? Okay, so for our other, we saw our specialty court grant today, and so I won't belabor that one. Now I'll talk about some other smaller programs that aren't tied to grants. As we have received over the past biennium or so, we received some pass-through funding that we will provide to the Family Preservation Project, which provides services within Coffee Creek to some of our female adults in custody. And so that's a program that was renewed. And also the U-Visa oversight data reporting that we were given a few years ago. That program was renewed as well. And what we're asked to do there is file an annual report that demonstrates the number of U-Visa applications that were asked for across the state, the number of approvals and denials, and the reason for those denials. We were also given 4 new programs, one of which was a retail theft grant. In SB 900, a grant was established with $5 million of initial funding to provide money to the state police or to local law enforcement to combat organized retail theft in the state. That bill has not yet been signed, but we're quite close to the deadline, so we expect that to come anytime. It will not go into effect until after the first of the year. There's also a requirement that we make rules for that grant, and so that's something that you all will see after the new year, and we'll try to move very quickly to hit the ground running on that one, since the rulemaking process sometimes can take a little bit of time. The second new program we were given was to shepherd through or to create a new Juvenile Justice Policy Commission. This is a commission that will operate, at least initially, under our commission. I think there's always been a vision that this could be something that could eventually spin off and be its own thing in the future, but it will initially live under CJC. That also will not become effective until the first of the year. So more to come on that once that bill has been signed. Two other items that we have, these are both more report-based types of programs. The first is in the end of session bill, we were asked to perform a study of the advantages and disadvantages of legalizing prostitution. And that is a report that will be due back to the legislature in September of 2024. So Director Officer, who you heard from earlier, is working with our research team and will be engaging in that. And you should hear back from us as we get closer to September 2024. We'll provide a preview of what we're finding before we turn in that report for your feedback. And then last, with a much faster turnaround time, in SB 337, which was the public defense kind of omnibus bill, the Criminal Justice Commission was asked to play a somewhat small role in basically trying to suss out what is the current situation across the state as far as the unrepresented crisis and what are counties doing to address that. And so in 337, what we've been asked to do is to receive reports from all of the state judicial districts across the state by September 1st of 2024, and then to review those reports and to create one unified report that we will turn in within about 30 days. So it's due on October 1st, that we'll provide to the legislature summarizing the efforts that are being taken in each of our districts. So staff at CJC, which includes myself and Kelly Officer, we've been attending meetings with OJD and OPDS as they have been doing their portions of the work tied to this one little piece of 337. We're beginning to, in fact, I'll be attending a Marion County meeting tomorrow to see how the judicial districts individually are kind of working through this issue. And so we'll be participating in those, and then we'll be ready to receive those reports on September 1st to provide a summary. And we plan to preview that to the commission. I'm not sure which meeting yet we'll be doing that, but we'll be trying to get that in front of you once we have something that we can report. We also expect to be asked to attend during legislative days in September to provide an update as well. And so those are the new programs that we have. I'm not sure if folks have any questions, but that's a quick rundown of what session brought to the Criminal Justice Commission.
Mr. Chair, may I ask another question?
Please.
I'm curious on the prostitution research. How do you do that work? I mean, is there a group assigned to that? I'm just curious how you actually get data that will be meaningful.
Commissioner Freeman, that is a great question. And so there was an initial bill that this program was put under, and in that bill it was left very, very broad. In fact, it was almost the same as what we saw in the end of session bill, which was just to study the advantages and disadvantages. We know from a data perspective that the data is actually quite thin. So when I've talked this over with our research director, the number of folks that we see in our system that actually fall under these crimes, it's not like when we've been doing some analyses in the past of possession of controlled substances or other types of other types of crimes. And we also know that a lot of times there are crimes that folks who are involved in this work will fall under that actually that aren't called prostitution, and that's really difficult for us to see. From our perspective, data perspective, we don't actually know that because all we see are kind of the ones and zeros that denote which crime they were charged with, as opposed to the context surrounding their cases. And so from a data perspective, we think that we will be able to provide everything we have, but it will not necessarily be a data-driven report like some of ours that we've seen in the past. And so what our plan has been, and what we've discussed with the legislature when we were asked simply, like, hey, if we give this to you, what are you going to do? Is our plan is to reach out to folks on all sides of the issue, to try to figure out what those advantages and disadvantages are. If possible, we hope to look into cost benefit analyses, which is something that's much more in our wheelhouse of these types of prosecutions, crimes, punishment. But then also we know that it's not all economic, right? And so we will have to think about, maybe the moral aspects and the other attendant things that go with it too. We've heard that there are some researchers who work at the OHSU and Portland State School of Public Health who have been looking into this and who had some involvement in some of the discussions around this bill. We've asked to meet with them. So far, we've not been connected with them yet to have that meeting, but we hope to have more updates as we go through, and I'd be happy to flag this as something that we can provide more updates as we go forward. Right now, though, we are very much in the planning phase, so if you have any feedback for us as well, we'd be happy to have it as we begin to scope this out. But this is one that was certainly dropped in our lap at the last second, and so we're still currently in that planning process. Oh, and I guess one other thing is I'll note that we do have, just serendipitously, a member of staff who has a PhD, whose one of her research areas was looking at prostitution and other related types of crimes. And so we at least have some expertise on staff that normally we're not that lucky that something drops in our lap, or we actually have somebody who's done some of that research in the past. And so she's going to be, along with our research director, the lead on that project.
Thank you for that answer.
Ken, are you able to comment on, I know you focused on the various items that were funded in the CJC budget, but can you talk about the things that weren't funded? I know there's restorative justice that got
Right.
cut. Were there other things that were eliminated from your budget? I guess not in your CSL budget, but that were, maybe grant funded.
Yes, thank you, Chair, for asking that question. The restorative justice funding was the one that we were the most surprised about and the most disappointed about. It was not included in our CSL budget because of the way that grant program was created and the grant funding was passed during the previous session. So it was something that we had to essentially treat as a new ask, even though it is for a pre-existing grant program. And unfortunately, that was one that we had expectations and in many cases, a lot of assurances that would be included as we went through legislative session. So when the end of session bill came out at the last minute, as you all know that happens, and it wasn't included, we were pretty surprised. So that is one that I know there are plans on behalf of program supporters and advocates to try to fight for that in the upcoming short session. And so that is really, aside from maybe there, we were putting forward asks, or at least we had some input into some of the HB 3000 task force bills associated with illegal marijuana for continuation of the higher level of funding for the illegal marijuana program. That also did not go forward. So in some ways we could say that we did see a reduction there, but also again, compared to CSL, we actually are in an okay spot. But those are the two programs that we were pushing for that didn't necessarily make it over the finish line, at least at the levels that we had hoped.
Great. Thank you. Others have questions or comments? All right. Anything else for us, Ken?
That's all I have on the agency update. One thing I will note, we know that things have been in the news quite a bit lately about the commutations that were undertaken by our previous administration. In the past, the commission has undertaken work to look at the commutations that were put through that were tied to COVID releases. And I just wanted to flag for the commission that we are currently working on an update to the COVID releases that we plan to present to this commission for your feedback very soon. I am not sure if we'll be quite ready at our next monthly meeting, but certainly we would by the meeting following. And I just wanted to put that out there on the record that this is something that's coming, that's something that you all will have an opportunity to look at, but also to note that, with the media coverage of the current case, the involvement of the 41 firefighter commutations, that is not data that we at the commission analyzed either in our previous report, nor do we possess. And so at least as far as that aspect of the commutations that went through, that's not something that we've been working on. So if you're expecting that from us, if you see a future agenda, I would hate to disappoint you, but we don't have data on those individuals.
Is that something you anticipate getting data on in the future?
It's not something that we anticipate getting data on. They're a very different case in this, or they're very different cases. The COVID releases came in waves. The firefighter releases have come out not haphazardly, but they basically the firefighter releases simply took 12 months off of a pre-existing sentence, and so they're coming out at very different times. They're not really, we can't treat them in this as almost cohorts in the same way that we have the COVID releases in the past. It's hard for us even, I mean, we could literally measure their risk time in the community, but they're not out at the same time, and they're not kind of in it's harder to look at them that way. Plus, with only 41 of them, usually we try to look at groups where we have an N or like 50 individuals to try to make conclusions out of those. And that goes back to our stop data and everything else. So we have these thresholds essentially for kind of statistical analysis, because certainly when you have really tiny groups, then, you know, a couple things happens to a few people in the groups can really skew those results. And so it's not something that we're anticipating doing right now. We're really focusing on those COVID releases that we've already begun to analyze.
Great. All right. Unless there's anything else for the good of our meeting today, I think we are adjourned. Thank you all for your time, and we'll see you at the next meeting.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care.
Bye-bye.